Mean girls. Snatched her scarf and taunted. She redeemed herself before last bell. Lenore Briarwood leaned against the rough brick of the old gymnasium wall, observing the throng of students filling the hallways like a busy marketplace she couldn't find a stall in. Nearly half a year at Crestwood Academy in Vermont, yet she still felt like a shadow, flitting through gatherings she wasn't invited to attend. Her mother's recent promotion at the firm had relocated them here, where her pale complexion and subdued nature made her stand out like a lone snowdrop in a field of wildflowers. She adjusted a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear and clutched her history binder, its weight a comfort in her slender fingers. Standing at barely 5'2", with a build that appeared fragile enough to shatter in a strong breeze, Lenore had understood early that blending in was her greatest defense. Back in Boston, she'd been just another face in the crowd. Here, she was the new student who spoke with a subtle cadence picked up from her grandfather's old stories. "Mind your own business, bookworm." The comment pierced her thoughts like a shard of ice. Bethany Sinclair stood squarely in front of her 5'9" frame obstructing her passage to third period. Her designer sweater stretched across athletic shoulders that had led Crestwood's field hockey team to 4 consecutive regional championships. Behind her, her ever-present sidekicks lingered, Tiffany Grant with her haughty expression and Chantel Dubois, whose sophistication came with a sting. Lenore's grip tightened around her binder. "Excuse me, I need to get to class." Bethany's giggle was brittle and insincere. "Did everyone hear that? She thinks she's important." She moved closer, her perfume overpowering. "This is Crestwood, darling. We have standards here." "I am being standard," Lenore mumbled, her voice almost lost in the hubbub of the hallway. "Not hardly." Tiffany sauntered forward, her phone already recording. "Say something in Latin for the camera." "I'm not from Rome, I'm from Massachusetts." The words escaped her with more firmness than she intended, and she instantly regretted the brief display of defiance. Chantel's perfectly painted lips twisted into a sneer that belonged in a horror film. "From Massachusetts? Prove it. Name all the presidents." A group was forming now, phone cameras pointed like weapons. Lenore felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rising up her neck, the same feeling she'd experienced when kids in elementary school asked if her clothes came from the poor store or when teachers mangled her last name despite repeated corrections. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said quietly, attempting to sidestep Bethany. Bethany's hand shot out, fingers closing around her upper arm. "Actually, you do. See, this is our school, our hallway, our rules." Lenore's free hand curled involuntarily, a remnant of muscle memory from countless hours in her father's basement-turned-studio threatening to emerge. She could feel the phantom weight of a violin bow in her fingers, hear his voice. "Poise, Lenore. Skill without poise is just noise." She forced herself to relax, to shrink smaller. "Let go of me," she whispered. Bethany's grip tightened. "Or what? You'll run crying to your mummy? Oh, wait, I heard she's working late again tonight. Typical lawyer." The words stung worse than any physical strike could have. Her father, Arthur Briarwood, had been a concert violinist in his youth, his fingers nimble enough to dance across the strings with lightning speed. Those same fingers now taught music to underprivileged children, his dreams of performing at Carnegie Hall buried under the responsibility of providing for his family. Lenore pulled free and hurried down the hallway, Bethany's laughter trailing after her like a pack of hyenas. She could hear Tiffany's voice floating over the crowd. "Did you see how pathetic she looked, like a little lost lamb?" History class passed in a haze of dates she couldn't concentrate on. Lenore sat in the back row, her usual spot, trying to ignore the hushed whispers and pointed looks. Mr. Henderson droned on about ancient civilizations, while Lenore's mind wandered to the worn violin case tucked away in her closet, to the soothing melodies that had been her refuge since she was 5 years old. Her father had begun teaching her after a particularly rough day at her old school, when she'd come home with a bruised cheek and ripped sweater. "Music isn't about escaping pain, Lenore," he'd told her, gently guiding her fingers onto the fingerboard. "It's about transforming it into something beautiful. But you must promise me, only when there is no other way." She'd made that promise, and she'd kept it through nearly half a year of escalating torment. Lunch period brought renewed humiliation. Lenore found an empty table in the far corner of the cafeteria, hoping to eat her salad in peace. She'd barely taken a bite when Bethany's shadow fell across her tray. "Well, if it isn't our favorite transplant," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "How's the food, Lenore?" "Not too bland for you." Before she could respond, Bethany's hand bumped into her milk carton, sending it cascading across her salad and skirt. The cold liquid soaked through her clothes as laughter erupted from nearby tables. "Oops," Bethany said with mock remorse. "My mistake. Maybe you should be more careful where you sit." Lenore stood slowly, milk dripping from her clothes. Every eye in the cafeteria was on her, some sympathetic but most eager for entertainment. She gathered her soggy lunch and walked to the bathroom, Bethany's voice following her. "Don't forget to wipe up your mess." In the bathroom mirror, she looked at herself. Truly looked. Her blue eyes held storms she'd been holding back for months. Her slender fingers, nimble and strong from years of playing the violin, trembled with repressed anger. She thought of her father's words about poise, about choosing battles carefully. But as she watched milk drip from her hair onto the bathroom floor, she wondered how long poise could contain the rising tide of fury in her chest. The breaking point came 3 days later in the library during study hall. Lenore had found what she believed was a safe spot near the reference section, sitting alone with a novel. Reading had always calmed her. Stories that unfolded with a sense of order when nothing else did. She was engrossed in a tale of faraway lands when a shadow fell across her page. Gillian Foster stood there, looking uneasy but determined. Gillian had attended Crestwood her entire life, growing up in town. Unlike Lenore, Gillian had a warm smile and genuine kindness that had quickly earned them a place among the more inclusive students. "Hey," Gillian said, settling down beside her. "Mind if I sit? That's a good book, by the way." Lenore felt heat rush to her cheeks. She'd been stealing glances at Gillian for weeks, admiring their intelligence and the way they challenged teachers who made insensitive comments. "Thanks. It's just a story." "Just a story?" Gillian laughed softly. "You've lost yourself in those pages. What is it about?" For the first time in months, Lenore smiled genuinely. "It's about a girl who finds her voice in a world that tries to silence her." They talked easily about books, about the differences between city life and small-town living, about the difficulty of adapting to a new environment. Lenore felt herself relaxing, felt the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crumble. When Gillian mentioned struggling with English literature, she offered to help. "You'd do that?" Gillian's eyes lit up. "That would be great. I'm completely lost in Mrs. Campbell's class." "Of course. We could meet here tomorrow after school." It was such a simple moment of human connection, but to Lenore, it felt like finding warmth in a blizzard. She was still smiling when Bethany and her crew appeared like a gathering of thunderclouds. "Well, well," Bethany announced, her voice cutting through their conversation. "Looks like the wallflower found herself a friend." Lenore's stomach plummeted. She'd been careful to stay to herself, to avoid drawing attention to anyone who might show her kindness. Now, her greatest fear was becoming reality. Her toxicity was spreading to someone who didn't deserve it. "Actually, we were just leaving," Gillian said calmly, beginning to stand. Tiffany blocked their path. "Not so fast. We haven't been formally introduced." She extended her hand toward Gillian with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm Tiffany. Welcome to Crestwood Academy, where we value tradition." Just not too much change, if you catch my drift. I don't, Gillian replied evenly, ignoring the outstretched hand. Chantel moved closer, her smile sharp. What my friend means is that we like to know who we're dealing with, and associating with certain people, well, it says a lot about what kind of person you are. Lenore stood abruptly, her novel falling to the floor. Leave them alone. This has nothing to do with Gillian. Oh, but it does, Bethany said, picking up her novel and flipping through it. See, Gillian here seems like good people, smart, friendly, probably has a bright future ahead of them. It would be a shame if they got mixed up with the wrong crowd. She held up a page from her novel, a passage she'd underlined that spoke of courage and defiance in the face of oppression. It was meaningful, personal, and seeing it in Bethany's hands felt like a violation. What's this? Your little manifesto. Bethany showed the book to her friends, who snickered. That's precious. Does your daddy teach you to rebel, or just to play pretty music for rich people? Something shifted inside Lenore's chest, like a glass breaking. Give that back. This? Bethany held the book higher, out of her reach. I think I'll keep it. Consider it a lesson in choosing your friends wisely. Gillian stepped forward. Give it back to her. Now. Or what? Chantel moved to face Gillian directly. You'll tell the headmaster? Run home to Mommy and Daddy? Newsflash, nobody cares about nobodies like you two. Bethany was still flipping through the book, her commentary growing more cutting with each page. Look at this one, guys. Is this supposed to be you, Lenore? Because I've got to say, you made yourself way more interesting than you really are. The laughter felt like acid on her skin. Students from other tables were starting to watch, phones appearing to capture whatever was about to unfold. Lenore could see the cruel anticipation in their eyes. The same look crowds got at sporting events, waiting for the big hit. Please, she whispered, hating how weak her voice sounded. Just give it back. Bethany's expression shifted, becoming something darker. You want it back? Beg for it. Get on your knees and beg, and maybe I'll think about it. The library had fallen silent, except for the rustle of pages turning in the distance. Lenore felt every eye on her, felt the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical burden. In her peripheral vision, she could see Gillian's face, shocked and angry on her behalf. I'm not going to beg, she said quietly. Then I guess you don't want it that badly. Bethany raised the novel above her head, preparing to tear it in half. Wait! The word burst from her lips before she could stop it. Bethany paused, savoring her victory. Changed your mind? Good. Now get down on your knees and say, Please, Bethany, I'm sorry for being so boring, and I promise to stay out of your way from now on. The words hung in the air like a shroud. Lenore felt something snap inside her chest, felt years of suppressed pride and unspoken anger finally reaching their breaking point. She looked at Gillian, saw the anger in their eyes, and made a choice. No, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the library. I won't beg, and I'm not going anywhere. Bethany's face darkened. Wrong answer. She ripped the novel in half, pages fluttering to the floor like fallen birds. Lenore's favorite story, her refuge, her inspiration, a part of her soul, lay scattered on the carpet. But instead of crushing her, seeing her book destroyed seemed to ignite something that had been dormant inside her chest. For the first time in months, Lenore felt her father's spirit flowing through her veins, felt the discipline he'd instilled in her muscle memory awakening like a sleeping giant. You're going to regret that, she said quietly. Bethany laughed, but there was something different in her tone that made her hesitate. What did you just say to me? Lenore bent down and gathered the torn pieces of her novel, her movements careful and deliberate. When she stood, her posture had transformed. Her shoulders were squared, her stance balanced, her hands loose at her sides in a way that spoke of resolve rather than submission. "I said you're going to regret that," she repeated, her voice carrying a new strength that made several students in the crowd shift uncomfortably. Tiffany stepped forward, sensing the shift in power but not understanding it. Did the little bookworm just threaten us? "She thinks she's tough now," Chantel added, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Bethany recovered her swagger, puffing out her chest. "You know what? I think it's time someone taught you a lesson about respect." She reached for Lenore's scarf, intending to grab and humiliate her further. Her fingers had barely brushed against the soft wool when everything changed. Lenore's left hand shot out in a fluid motion, deflecting Bethany's hand away. Her right hand flew upward in a swift, controlled strike that connected with Bethany's wrist. Bethany yelped in pain, her grip loosening. Lenore seized the opportunity, stepping forward and using her shoulder to shove Bethany backward. The library erupted in gasps of surprise. Bethany stumbled backward, clutching her wrist, disbelief etched on her face. "What the?" Tiffany charged forward with a clumsy swing, more shocked than skilled. Lenore sidestepped her attack easily, her body moving with the effortless grace of years of playing the violin. She grabbed Tiffany's outstretched arm, twisted it gently, and used a simple pressure point technique to send her crumpling to the floor. The soft thud echoed through the suddenly silent library. Chantel backed away, her earlier confidence crumbling. "You freak! I'm getting security." "Go ahead," Lenore said calmly, barely winded. "Tell them what happened. Tell them how 3 of you cornered me and destroyed my property." Bethany struggled to regain her composure, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her carefully applied makeup. "You little nobody! Do you have any idea who you just messed with?" "Yeah," Lenore replied, adopting a stance that would have made her father proud. "I messed with a mean girl who doesn't know when to quit." Bethany lunged at her with the blind rage of someone who'd never faced real resistance before. Lenore stepped aside, letting Bethany's momentum carry her forward, then delivered a swift kick to the back of her knee. As Bethany stumbled, Lenore caught her with a gentle push that sent her sprawling onto the carpet. Bethany lay motionless on the floor, stunned and defeated. The silence that followed was deafening. Students stood frozen, phones still recording, unable to comprehend what they'd just witnessed. The quiet girl who'd been tormented for months had just neutralized 3 bullies with the precision of a trained musician. Lenore stood over Bethany's still form, her chest rising and falling steadily. For a moment, she felt the urge to continue, to make them pay for every insult, every cruel word, every moment of fear they'd inflicted on her. Her fists clenched, and she could feel the dark satisfaction of vengeance beckoning to her. But then she heard her father's voice in her memory. "Skill without poise is just noise, Lenore. The greatest musicians know when to silence the chaos." She unclenched her fists and stepped back, looking down at Bethany's prone form. "Stay down," she said softly. "We're finished here." Tiffany was slowly pulling herself up from the floor, her face pale with shock and pain. Chantel stood frozen near the bookshelves, her usual sophistication shattered. Neither of them made any attempt to help their fallen leader. "What is going on here?" The voice belonged to Ms. Davison, the school librarian, who had arrived just in time to see Bethany lying on the floor. Her eyes moved from the scattered book pages to the stunned students, to Lenore, who stood calmly in the center of it all. "Bethany tripped and fell," Gillian said quickly, stepping to Lenore's side. "Hit her head pretty hard." Several students nodded in agreement, and Lenore was surprised to see sympathetic faces in the crowd. Apparently, Bethany's reign of terror had created more enemies than friends. "Is that correct, Miss Briarwood?" Miss Davison asked, her tone carefully neutral. Lenore looked down at Bethany, then at the torn remains of her novel scattered across the carpet. She thought about her father's teachings, about the difference between defending yourself and seeking revenge, about the line between justice and cruelty. She was harassing me and my friend, she said finally. I defended myself. Miss Davison nodded slowly. She'd been a librarian long enough to recognize the signs of a bullying situation, and she'd witnessed enough of Bethany's behavior to know which side was more likely telling the truth. Tiffany, Chantel, help get Bethany to the nurse's office, she instructed. Everyone else clear out. Study hall is over. As the crowd dispersed, Gillian bent down and began gathering the pieces of Lenore's torn novel. Some of these might be repairable, they said softly. Lenore knelt beside them, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Thank you for sticking up for me, I mean. Thank you for standing up for both of us, Gillian replied, meeting her eyes. That was amazing. Where did you learn to do that? My father taught me, Lenore said, feeling a surge of pride in her voice. He said I should only use it to protect myself or others who couldn't protect themselves. Well, mission accomplished, Gillian said with a smile. I don't think Bethany will be bothering anyone for a while. Over the following days, word of the library incident spread through Crestwood Academy like wildfire. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had Lenore taking on 6 attackers, others claimed Bethany was in the hospital with a broken arm. The truth was both simpler and more profound. A quiet girl had finally found her voice, and the school's most notorious bully had learned that her victims weren't as helpless as she'd assumed. Bethany returned to school a week later with a sling on her arm and a noticeably subdued attitude. She avoided Lenore completely, her usual arrogance replaced by nervous glances and careful detours around her locker. Tiffany and Chantel followed her lead, their cruel comments replaced by hushed conversations that ceased whenever Lenore passed by. The change in atmosphere was immediate and transformative. Students who had never spoken to Lenore before offered small smiles of recognition as she walked the halls. Teachers who had previously overlooked the subtle signs of harassment suddenly seemed more attuned to classroom dynamics. Even the groundskeeper, Mr. Johnson, stopped her one morning to say, "My granddaughter heard what you did. I'm proud of you, child." But perhaps the most significant change was within Lenore herself. She walked taller now, her gaze steady instead of averted, her eyes meeting those of others instead of studying the floor. The invisible barriers she'd erected around herself had dissolved, replaced by a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with self-worth. 3 weeks after the confrontation, she was leaving the music room after a violin lesson with her father when she overheard familiar voices around the corner. Bethany and her remaining followers were gathered near the vending machines, their conversation subdued but intense. "I'm telling you, she's not normal," Tiffany was saying. "Nobody learns to do that just by reading books." "Maybe her dad really was some kind of martial arts expert," Chantel added uneasily. "I heard he's a black belt or something." Bethany's voice was softer than Lenore had ever heard it, devoid of its usual scorn. "Doesn't matter. We're done with her. She wants to be left alone. She gets left alone." "Since when do you back down from anyone?" Tiffany challenged. Bethany was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Since I realized that being powerful doesn't mean you have to hurt people who are weaker than you. She could have really hurt me that day, and she chose not to. That's the kind of power I never understood before." Lenore felt a strange mix of satisfaction and compassion at her words. Bethany was learning, evolving, becoming something better than what she'd been. But she also knew that growth often came at the expense of others' suffering, and she wondered how many students like her had endured before Bethany's epiphany arrived. She turned away from the conversation and found Gillian waiting by the main entrance, their face radiant with the smile that had become the best part of Lenore's days. "Ready for that tea?" Gillian asked, slinging their backpack over their shoulder. "Absolutely," Lenore replied, pushing through the double doors into the Vermont sunshine. As they walked toward town, Gillian suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "That day in the library, when you decided to stand up, what shifted? What made you finally fight back?" Lenore pondered the question thoughtfully. "I think it was watching her destroy something I loved. My story, my safe haven. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting me anymore. It was just enabling her to keep erasing pieces of who I was. And now," Lenore glanced back at the school building, where students were streaming out into the afternoon light. Some walked alone, some in pairs, but all of them moved with the awareness that bullying had repercussions, that victims could become survivors, that power dynamics could shift in the blink of an eye. "Now I know that being strong doesn't mean you have to hurt people," she said, "but it also doesn't mean you have to let them hurt you." Gillian nodded understandingly. "Your father sounds like a remarkable man." "He is," Lenore agreed, thinking of Arthur Briarwood returning home each evening with weary hands and patient eyes, ready to listen to her stories and reassure her that strength came in many forms. "He taught me that playing music isn't about winning or losing. It's about expressing yourself with integrity, even when you're afraid." "Were you afraid that day?" Lenore smiled faintly, remembering the moment when Bethany's hand had touched her scarf, when nearly half a year of repressed anger had finally found its voice. "Terrified. But I was more afraid of what I'd become if I kept letting them trample all over me." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the Green Mountains rising in the distance like gentle guardians. Lenore reflected on the girl she'd been just a month ago, quiet, invisible, insecure. That girl still existed within her, but now she was accompanied by someone stronger, someone who grasped that true power came not from the ability to inflict pain, but from the courage to defend yourself and those you cared about. At the tea shop, Gillian insisted on paying for their drinks as a celebration. "To standing up," they said, raising their cup in a toast. "To knowing when to be at peace," Lenore replied, clinking her cup against theirs. As the afternoon sun streamed through the tea shop windows, Lenore pondered the lessons her father had imparted to her, both in the music room and in life. Violence was never the first solution, but sometimes it was the only language bullies understood. The secret was using that language to communicate boundaries, not to inflict unnecessary suffering. Bethany's wrist had healed, but her perspective had been forever changed. Tiffany and Chantel had learned that cruelty had consequences, and Lenore had discovered that the quiet strength her father had always seen in her could coexist with the fierce determination to never again allow anyone to make her feel small. The girl who had leaned against cold gymnasium walls and yearned for invisibility was gone, replaced by someone who grasped that true strength wasn't about the ability to strike a blow. It was about possessing the wisdom to know when action was necessary and the character to show compassion when it wasn't. Ultimately, the most significant victory hadn't been the incident in the library. It had been the moment afterward, when she'd chosen to step back instead of forward, when she'd remembered her father's voice and honored the values he'd instilled in her. Mean girls had snatched her scarf and taunted, thinking they'd found another easy target. Instead, they'd awakened something that had been dormant within her all along. Not a monster, but a protector. And that protector would ensure that no one at Crestwood Academy would ever again mistake her quietness for weakness, her kindness for vulnerability, or her desire for peace as an invitation for war. Length: 25,745 characters.